It was crafted from sycamore in the mid-13th century and brought here in 1927. It represents the remarkable medieval heritage of this region.
The mid-13th century in Europe is the era of Thomism, and there was a great discussion at this time about questions not so dissimilar to those that concerned German idealists of the classical Weimar period. I don't know the extent to which these medieval discussions reached Weimar or Dullstadt, which is about 50 kilometres from here, but when I look at this piece I see tremendous conviction and commitment in its crafting. It's clear to me that the circumstances around its fashioning were likely connected in some way to the issues I'm looking at.
Of course, this is the era of church supremacy and high scholasticism, and top of the agenda were issues pertaining to the nature of the cosmos. This crucifix is made of wood. It's a solid material. It has substance. It's real. However, if this is called the triumph crucifix, then what about the triumph? Is that a real thing as well? And what if there were to be a whole collection of crucifixes in the museum? Clearly, one particular crucifix alone can be called a real object. But what about the word crucifixes, the universal term that applies to all of them? Does the general term refer to a particular object in reality?
During the mid-13th century, when this particular crucifix was made, and for the first time in a long time, people were saying no, triumph is not a thing, and no, the universal term crucifixes does not designate a tangible entity in itself. Triumph is just a word, a concept in the mind. This was the new nominalist argument, and it was in conflict with the prevalent norm of metaphysical realism, whereby universal terms existed as actual entities in a realm beyond the physical world.
Mind and nature, don't speak to Christians so. That's why men burst atheists below. Such speech is dangerous, all right? Nature is sin, and mind's the devil. It harbours within it doubt, that evil, their misshapen hermaphrodite. Not so with us.
For more than 1,000 years, the most influential thinker and writer on the attributes of existence was Plato. He lived in the 4th century before the Common Era in Athens, ancient Greece, and had posited that universals such as triumph or the plural term crucifixes have a real existence, although it's not the same kind of existence as that pertaining to solid objects. He argued that beyond the world of physical matter, there's a realm of ideas or forms that are just as real as a material world, but whose role is to constitute archetypal forms for both particulars and universals. In other words, a rock is able to exist in the cosmos because there's an eternal, unchangeable, archetypal form of rock in the realm of ideas that allows physical rocks to form from the basic pattern. Similarly, a circle can be drawn because there's an everlasting archetypal circle in the realm of forms that allows it. Similarly, triumph exists as an archetypal form that can be realized in the real world by way of circumstances that call upon the attributes of this archetypal form.
The idea of a metaphysical realm of forms beyond the material reality was well received during the turn in religious thought away from the many gods of Latin culture to the monotheistic God of the Abrahamic tradition. God existed in a spiritual realm beyond the material world and was immanent in the world by way of the material realization of the spiritual form. However, by the 12th century, scholars had begun to translate and evaluate the work of another ancient Greek thinker, Plato's student Aristotle. Actually, the first translations taken seriously appeared in the Muslim world in Cordoba, Spain. There was a great effort to assimilate a more rational approach towards justifying knowledge into Islamic teachers by figures such as Ibn Rushd, better known in the West by his Latin name Averroes or Averroes. He was a theologian, a scientist, a mathematician, and a philosopher, and he was determined to bring together revealed religion and the use of reason and logic prevalent in these other disciplines. Indeed, such was his success and influence that, in a sense, he could be credited as the founder of secular thought in Europe. In his work on the harmony of religions and philosophy, he wrote, "On the whole, a man who denies the existence of the effects arranged according to the causes in the questions of arts, or whose wisdom cannot understand it, then he has no knowledge of the art of its maker. So also a man who denies the existence of an order of effects in accordance with causes in this universe denies the existence of the Creator altogether. Their saying that God is above these causes, and that they cannot have any bearing on the effects by his command, is very far from the true nature of philosophy, nay, it is a destroyer of it."
Averroes had been led by a conviction that the truths contained in Islamic religious doctrine could be given a rational basis, and thereafter, presented with translations of the same Aristotelian texts Averroes had read, Christian scholars were also challenged with new insights into areas of logic, metaphysics, and natural philosophy. There was renewed respect for sciences such as astronomy, physics, mathematics, and medicine, which had previously been the exclusive domain of theology.
It became obvious to all that each discipline, including theology itself, had its own separate mode of operation, its own methodology. The Europeans realised this was how Averroes and other Arabic scholars had handled the new disciplines so effectively, by avoiding recourse to the divine as a default foundational authority, and by handling each area autonomously. However, there was still tension between religious-based truths and those based on reason. Even if ultimately they shared a common goal, the disparate methods created an irreconcilable gulf between the different types of knowledge and their respective implications. The Italian Thomas Aquinas followed the same path, attempting to establish grounds for a union of reason and religion, a naturalised theology. He believed it was an essential task because there were limits to the scope of the rationalising mind. It couldn't answer all questions. Some truths could only be justified by way of faith in revelation, such as the reality of the Holy Trinity and the resurrection of the Christ. Nevertheless, there were other matters for which rationalism could provide illuminating insight. According to the foundations of Aristotelian science, existence did not begin with the realm of ideas, of universals which were the archetypal forms of particulars. Instead, existence started with a material object, the particular, which contained its own essence within itself, and not in some transcendental realm at all. Aristotle had said that this essence is embodied as a potential reality only by way of the material. It gains its reality only when the particular gains a reality. He argued that as particulars are constantly changing in terms of their structure and behaviour, potentiality is changing too, according to a hierarchical structure of levels ranging from degrees of contingent probability to God as absolute necessity.
I should go back in time again to explain. One of the first voices in this debate, the first empiricists, or scientists committed to studying the world rather than merely speculating about it hypothetically, was the ancient Greek Heraclitus. He argued that things are always changing, even if they appear superficially to be fixed and permanent.
In contrast, Parmenides was the first rationalist or theorist. He argued that there are some things that are fixed, those things that can be argued by reason alone and without any recourse at all to the senses. For instance, 2 and 2 makes 4. Whatever else happens in the world, this never changes. He speculated that this kind of rational knowledge reveals a fixed and unchanging structure to the cosmos, which in turn underpins a seemingly endless change. Beneath the surface, he said, the world comprises a fixed reality.
Plato came next, with a little help from Socrates. He sought to fuse these two approaches. He argued that the empirical and rational worlds proposed by Heraclitus and Parmenides could be shown as an integrated whole. His theory of forms, which I've already introduced, argued that the form of any particular object in the world is a manifestation of the archetypal or perfect form of the object. So a harpsichord can be fashioned in many designs. There's one of Duchess Anna Amalia's harpsichord elsewhere in the Weimar City Castle. But there's an archetypal harpsichord that exists in the realm of forms that enables all particular harpsichords to be manifested.
Plato had described metaphysical archetypes as eternal and unchangeable, yet this did not explain how or why the natural world could be in constant flux. So, Aristotle argued for a synthesis of Plato's theory of forms with an objective empiricist approach to the natural world. In his Metaphysics, he argued that whenever an object changes, such as when a harpsichord goes out of tune or coffee is spilled on it, there's something that persists despite the change, the essence of the object that makes it that object. Yet at the same time, something new develops that did not exist before, and that comes into existence as a result of the change, in this case the coffee stain. Aristotle concluded existence comprises of two types of substance: the form, which is the essence, and the matter, which is that which undergoes a process of change, of becoming.
So, Aristotle argued that objects, whether particulars or universal, possess an underlying essence, which comprises the attributes necessary to make that object what it is. For example, he argued that the essence of a human being lies in rationality, and not the physical body.
If people are unfortunate enough, for instance, to lose a limb in an accident, they would still be human. However, if they were a creature born in the form of a human but without the faculty of human reason, excepting those with cognitive impairments who might lack reason due to exceptional circumstances, if they were more akin to a barking dog in their normal condition, despite looking like a human, then they would not be human. They would possess the essence of being this dog-like creature.
Here's a more modern example. If a gold-looking substance turned out to be fool's gold because it was shown to have a different molecular structure compared to real gold, then the substance would not have the essence of being gold. Here's another example attributable to Aristotle. A bronze statue possesses both matter, its brass, which is subject to change when dug out of a mine and sculpted into statue shape, and form, which is the essence of the statue, that which makes it a statue.
When these ideas reached the Latin world, thinking was turned upside down. In contrast to the Neoplatonist position, whereby universals are real objects, substantive patterns that exist in advance of the particular, theologians, such as the 12th century Peter Abelard, argued that a universal with a real existence could not have the same properties as the particular. For instance, it was unreasonable to think of a universal living organism, such as the archetypal squirrel climbing in the archetypal tree, having both sentient, that is physical, and non-sentient, non-physical attributes at the same time. A squirrel that is not a squirrel, and a tree that is not a tree. And so, following on from the Aristotelian argument that existence is to be described in terms of form and matter, whereby the forms exist as mental constructs rather than in some supernatural realm, Abelard argued a universal was not something of real existence, but an abstraction created by thought, by the mind. When these ideas reached the mid-13th century, Thomas of Aquinas sought to identify the Aristotelian principles of form and matter, or potentiality and reality, with religious truth. God as the prime mover had created the world whereby it possesses both potentiality of essence and the reality of the physical world, which together produces the process of becoming, the cycle of living and dying. Thomism argued that the entire process is to be conceived as an expression of divine reason.
However, it was clear that the nominalist account derived from this revised construct of existence was pointing to the nature of humanity as possessing a more creative, active capacity. The medieval concept of man as a merely acquiescent agent under the dominion of authoritative God was challenged.
If the relationship between theological and reason-based accounts of the world was becoming increasingly strained in Aquinas' time, then matters only got worse until, a generation later, William of Ockham, in an effort to appease the growing complexity of arguments required for reconciliation, introduced his two principles of authority in economy. The first explained how God had created the world of his own free will, and how this implied existence could have been ordered differently. Existence was therefore contingent rather than necessary, and there was no purpose in trying to ground existence in an unchangeable Neoplatonist realm. The world is one of many possible worlds, and furthermore, given that only God exists necessarily and that all else is contingent, the nature of reason is clearly distinguishable from the nature of God. Reason is a methodology for locating rationality in the world, and divine revelation is a means by which it's possible to locate universality and necessity, to make an ontological commitment to the existence of God. Reason alone cannot by definition gain any insight into the universal essence and contingent freedom of God. Ockham's principle of authority implied a rejection of the Augustinian tradition whereby the mind of God can be perceived by way of contemplation and introspection, and yet it maintained the intellectual legitimacy of the mysticism of God.
Ockham's second principle, the principle of economy, is embodied in the notion of Ockham's razor, whereby the complexity of entities or of definitions of existence should not be multiplied beyond that which is really required. Superfluous explanations should be avoided at all costs.
He was calling for an end to the increasingly speculative and unjustifiable forms of metaphysical conjecture that characterised his age and bordered on the ridiculous. But actually, this principle also amounts to an early version of the science methodology of hypothesis testing, whereby arguments that might lead to false assumptions should be avoided.
Ockham was a nominalist too, distinguishing the facts of empirical knowledge from any abstract ideas that might be based on that knowledge. He argued that words are symbols constructed in the mind to convey meaning and to act as representations in thought. Only material things have existence, and it's they that are the basis of science, while the basis of religion lies in abstract ideas, which are derived by the mind from the material.
Ockham said that, consequently, it's impossible to prove the existence of God, given that the term God is only derivative and has no basis in experience. Therefore, there can be only faith in and no real knowledge of God. Here, Ockham is talking about the basis of knowledge itself. He's a first epistemologist, long before Kant, and one of the figures who opened up the possibility for more sceptical and critical approaches to reason, and thereafter the political upheavals of the Renaissance and the Reformation.
Actually, there's an aspect of the triumph crucifix that was never discussed by medieval thinkers, not to my knowledge. I suppose it was too radical for that time. The notion of triumph is not something merely to be debated metaphysically. It also has aesthetic meaning. Passive recipients don't think aesthetically, but nominalists do. And undoubtedly, some of those Weimar churchgoers of long ago would have been entertaining aesthetic notions when they named this figure the triumphant. I'm sure they would have considered it both tragic and beautiful too. And in the beauty, as Nietzsche would have said, the horror of the contingent is stated explicitly. For a moment, all of mortality is made impotent, and at the end, in God's glory, it is the beauty that is triumphant. No, maybe Nietzsche wouldn't have said that. Before I finish, I've come to see another figure in the Castle Museum. This is The Freezing Girl by Jean-Antoine Houdon. It was a notorious piece when it was sculpted in the late 18th century. There were those who praised the way classical qualities had been translated into the modern age, and others who regarded it as overtly explicit and debased.
Whatever the talk, Duke Karl August wanted a copy for his collection here in the refurbished castle, but by then he had limited funds at his disposal. Marble and bronze copies were too expensive, so instead he bought this papier-mâché copy, made of a mix of paper, glue and clay. And thus he too was able to celebrate that when the constraints of convention and the fears that underpin it are overcome, at the end, it's the aesthetics of tragedy and beauty that are triumphant.
Well, that's enough for now. To finish, I'll play another section from the music I played at the beginning of this episode, from the second movement of my third symphony, Hermeneutic Renewal. The music makes reference to the 12th century Hildegard of Bingen, who looked to Augustine for a guidance as regards emergent faith, and also the interpretation of mystical visions. I'll revisit Augustine on another occasion, when I get to the importance of the Reformation to the Weimar tradition. In the meantime, thanks for listening.